and welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Anastasia Lavrina. On August 24th, Ukraine marked its 35th Independence Day with a powerful display of European political support, but also against the backdrop of a war that shows a little sign of moving closer to an end. European leaders gathered in Kyiv while the coalition of the willing met to discuss the next stage of support for Ukraine. British Prime Minister Andy Burnham chose Kyiv for his first overseas visit since taking office, reaffirming London's commitment and announcing further cooperation on long-range missile production and defense technology. But beyond the symbolism of these visits lies a much more difficult question. Can Europe translate political solidarity into the military capabilities Ukraine urgently needs, particularly air defense, and at the same time create the conditions for a diplomatic breakthrough? To unpack all of this, I'm joined now by John Kavulik, senior editor at Issue Insight, joining us from New York, United States, and Melih Demirtas, political analyst and former diplomat from Ankara, Turkey. Dear experts, welcome to Inside Politics. And Mr. Kavulik, if you don't mind, let's start with a question to you. During the British Prime Minister's visit to Kyiv, one of the most significant announcements concerned Storm Shadow. The UK has agreed to release classified information on British components to support plans for local assembly of the missile in Ukraine. How significant is this shift from supplying Ukraine with long-range weapons to helping it develop a greater capacity to produce them domestically?
It has both the optical impact as well as the practical impact. The practical impact is it will permit Ukraine to have a greater technological foundation from which to further develop its internally designed military equipment. So that's helpful to it. It also permits the UK to have operational experience with its weaponry. And so overall for Ukraine, it's helpful in terms of reaching further into the Russian Federation. But the Storm Shadow missiles are not long-range, ultra-long-range, 500, 1,000 plus kilometer types. These are 100-mile, 150 miles. So they're somewhat use within the international territory of Ukraine that Russia occupies, and then a little bit further in. So the cities of Belgorod in Russia, the cities of Kursk in Russia, which are the mere cities closest to the border with Ukraine, just like Kyiv and Sumy are, and Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine. Optically is where it gets a little more interesting, and that is the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, President Putin, and his advisors, have said that this is an escalation, that this isn't, that other countries shouldn't help Ukraine, and that this is bringing other countries into the war, and there could be consequences, might be consequences. We don't know what those consequences will be, but hey, they're going to be, sort of in the ether. And, the reality is, of course, that Russia is getting assistance from China, from North Korea, and Iran. Ukraine is getting assistance from basically the 27 members of the European Union, the 32 members of NATO, as well as other countries. So the war is already over during the last 5 years, far expanded from Russia fighting Ukraine. It's, just much, much greater than that.
Mr. Demirtas, indeed, Russia argues that the UK's decision to share classified missile technology with Ukraine amounts to direct military involvement in the conflict. From an international and strategic perspective, where is the line between providing military assistance to a country at war and becoming directly involved in that conflict? And does this latest decision move Britain any closer to that line?
Thank you again, Mr. Lavina, for having me in this critical topic, because this issue, as the other valuable expert said, that in these last 5 years, it really makes us somehow, I think, very pessimistic, because we know that this conflict is not the conflict, as the other expert said, that conflict between Ukraine and Russia. it directly affects the other region, directly affects, as Mr. Zelensky once said, I think several times he also declares that, directly affects the Iranian war, the other projections of some actors, even Israel's projections, I mean, in these Middle Eastern unilateral actions of this country. And we can say that Russia-Ukrainian war really started something. This something is like, as you said, also providing some assistance. It started just with some intelligence sector. We know that providing intelligence started to be as a must for some actors. I mean, of course, of United States sometimes. But first of all, after maybe Mr. Trump's and his changing policies, we can see a much more active United Kingdom. As you said, the British-Russian relations, maybe due to these historical baggages. We can say that there is an unnamed, maybe named, enmity, hostility between these two important actors, I mean, from the imperial times, we can say, because we all know that this story sometimes means a lot in these diplomatic corridors. Because of this British-Russian relations also turns to be so tense in this Ukrainian conflict. We also see that some important figures always appearing, as you said in your coverage, in your first coverage, that some prime ministers always maybe start to appear in their first visits in this country, I mean, Ukraine. Like Mr. Burnham, I mean, the new prime minister's first visits also, I mean, this country, Ukraine. So we can say, yes, it will create a new, maybe a very tensive atmosphere. Especially, we must not forget that Russia still has an important capability in this geography. We must not forget it is not the geography of Britain. It is still the geography of somehow this Eurasian line. And in this Eurasian line, Russia's, I mean, ability can somehow really extend to some other communities, to some other intelligence sectors, to other countries. Even inside Britain, we can see some effects of this Russian policy somehow in the last, I mean, decades, as you remember. So we must be very careful. In providing such an assistance, it can really create a new vacuum, a new maybe tension, and it will not a good, I think, news, especially for some civilian lives and civilian structures, both in Ukraine, I think also in Russia now.
That's very interesting indeed, Mr. Kavulik. There is another contradiction here. Storm Shadow production is a longer-term project, while Ukraine says it urgently needs air defense interceptors now. Are European governments investing in capabilities that may matter in 2027, while Ukraine's more immediate vulnerability is its ability to defend its skies today?
Yeah, that's one of the most challenging questions and discussions that President Zelensky and his team have every day, and that is their daily needs are always a year to two ahead of the ability of their allies and their friends to provide for Ukraine. Part of that is Ukraine on the battlefield is moving forward the technological foundations of how we define war. And the capacity within the 32 members of NATO, within the 27 members of the European Union, even in the US, in Asia countries, it just isn't able to keep up. Primarily, we always talk about the Patriot missile systems with the US. The US produces roughly 600 of these a year. Now the US government's trying to expand that, but you have to then have budgetary authority. Then you have to give that money to the companies. The companies then have to build the factories, but they're scared to build the factories because what happens when President Trump leaves on January 2029? And what if the Ukraine-Russia war is over and then taxpayers start saying, wait a minute, why are we spending all this money on this equipment, on military equipment? The same thing's happening within the EU. President Zelensky, during the festivities for the 35th anniversary of the independence of Ukraine, he said, we need $27 billion more for defense. He's basically asking every member of the European Union for $1 billion. And that's just tough to happen. Italy is already backing away from some of its commitments. Germany as well, because there are elections coming up. Taxpayers want to see a peace dividend. They don't want to be spending money on missiles. They want to be spending money on schools and hospitals and roads. And then you have within NATO, particularly within the EU, but more importantly within NATO, you have friction. Greece doesn't want to give up its patriots to Ukraine, not because it's scared of Russia, but because it's scared of Turkey, another member of NATO. And you can find Spain doesn't necessarily want to give up its patriots, partly because it wants to limit what kind of offensive technologies and capacities to deliver in Ukraine, but also it says, well, we may need this stuff. And that's where the heads are butting, which is Ukraine is saying, hey, look, don't worry about tomorrow. Greece, don't worry about Turkey attacking you. Give us your patriots today so we can finish this once and for all with Russia. And that's an argument that's going to continue, and it's going to roll in. We're rolling now in on the second week in September. We have the BRICS summit in India, where you're going to have China, you're going to have Russia, you're going to have President Erdogan or Turkey, you're going to have Iran. So you can have all these countries talking about that. Then they roll into the UN General Assembly in September. President Xi comes to Washington in September. There's just all this happening, and unfortunately, it means delay for Ukraine.
Mr. Kolik, one additional question to you before I address my next question to Mr. Demirtas. So we often hear that additional military pressure is necessary to bring Russia to the negotiating table. But after years of sanctions, weapons deliveries, and battlefield pressure, what evidence is there that another increase in pressure will produce a different political calculation in Moscow?
Unfortunately, what's really left is for Ukraine to continue what it's doing. Primarily, the last 4 years, Ukraine was constrained with respect to its own technologies, its own capacity, and then with whatever it was given, there were conditions. Basically, don't fire into Russia itself. You can hit the territory in Ukraine that Russia's in to push them out of your own territory, but we really don't want you bringing the war into Russia, particularly with our equipment. That's changed over the last year and a half, and it's accelerated during the last year. And now, primarily, Ukraine is able to hit, and they're hitting deep, and they're hitting infrastructure in Russia. And it is causing inconvenience. The Russian people are noticing it. Someone who I know in Moscow woke up at 4:00 a.m. last week to go to the gas station, because it was the only time of the morning where the line wasn't hundreds of vehicles. So you're seeing that the Russian people are inconvenienced. But the Russian political system makes it so that if Russian people aren't happy, they don't have an awful lot of opportunity to show that they're unhappy, sustain that unhappiness, and then force the government to change, because the government isn't as elastic as, or it's actually more elastic than would be a democracy or Ukraine, where the leadership would have to respond. And so I don't think that there's much that's going to happen other than this continuing corrosion of the Russian economy. It's not collapsing, but it's corroding. And then lastly, Ukraine is now killing Russian civilians. They're not targeting Russian civilians, but they're accepting that they're going to kill Russian civilians. That's new, because they know that for every one Russian they kill, the Russian response is they're going to kill 20 Ukrainians. And so that has to be brought into the calculation. And that's why, I don't think we're going to see anything remarkable quickly. But, we don't know what President Trump, might want to do during the next months.
Mr. Demirtas, if Russia concludes that European support for Ukraine is effectively open-ended, what incentive does Moscow have to compromise now rather than continue fighting in the expectation that political unity in the West may eventually weaken?
First of all, Russia also knows. Also, I think all the actors in the region knows that there's more weaponization. This hard politics understanding can serve some actors more than the others. First of all, Russia always, I think, has a life or has a lifestyle of some, weaponization. After this end of the Second World War, We know that the very fast and turmoil years of the Soviet Union, which also includes the Ukrainian lifestyle. Also, we know that this, as the other experts said, that the rapid maybe weaponization, technological expertise in Ukraine, it also came from this Soviet Union times. We all know that Russia really knows very well how to weaponize and how to use these tactics against, of course, its adversaries, of course, its rivals. And now, against such a political unity, first of all, it can maybe show first its hard power. We know that this hard power rhetoric is number one Russian, tactic in both foreign policy, also in its cultural life, also with its own community and even diaspora in some other, of course, European countries. But in the sense of maybe this alliance building, maybe we can see that Russia also will use the other side of world, much more in a professional or diplomatic way. We can see in this last Iranian crisis, if you look this 6 months of this Iranian crisis, we can see not maybe a total loss of United States power or image, but a credible loss of United States image, both in military level, in diplomatic level. And in this case, I think thanks to maybe help of this Russian and thanks to help this Chinese support, we can see and we can feel this in this Iranian conflict. In the Ukrainian conflict, we can feel the same. I think Russia will use this other side of this world politics, the vacuum in this world politics, as the other experts said, in BRICS, maybe in United Nations level. Think about this, maybe this Secretary General's politics. Mr. Antonio Guterres, he always makes some equalizations. One, he's just visit the Moscow, for example. One, he just visit the Beijing, and other day, of course, always in New York. He just make an equal maybe diplomacy. It is the right style also of what United Nations must do. Because of this, maybe Mr. Trump always said some quote-unquote negative opinions also to the Secretary General. But also Russia and Russian diplomacy, and also Mr. Putin and Lavrov, I think, know this reality very well. And we can see a much more active Russia also in diplomatic field. Even in Turkey, in my country, we can see that some equal understanding of diplomacy must go on. Because when we see, like Britain always saying, this weaponization brings more stability, more peaceful environment. No, I don't think that, especially the people of this region, in Eurasia, also in Middle East, we do not believe in such simple terms, like once Cold War theoreticians said. It is not the right time to think much more weaponization. Yes, we must think much more professional Ukraine, much more technical Ukraine, but not a warlike Ukraine, who can really build more weapons every day, with the support of Britain, Germany, or France. And diplomacy must win at the end of the day, and we hope so that maybe this Istanbul talks, this diplomatic level of talks will continue in the next level.
Mr. Demirtas, one more question to you. The stance of the United States at the recent meetings held in Kyiv. UK Prime Minister promised to discuss this issue with US President Donald Trump, asking for more military support for Ukraine. But President Trump has repeatedly pushed Europe to take greater responsibility for its own security. Discussions in Kyiv show that Europe still needs Washington when it comes to some of Ukraine's most critical military requirements, particularly Patriot interceptors. What arguments could European leaders realistically make to persuade President Trump to join this coalition?
It's a very good question, also a very critical question, but I think that nothing changed since this humiliating and very sad Oval Office meeting with Mr. Zelensky and Trump, I think just 2 years ago. The first visit of Mr. Zelensky in the second term of Mr. Trump. And in terms of diplomacy, in terms of this traditional positive talking in diplomacy, I think these images were not so, as you may remember, not so optimistic. But since that time, of course, we have seen many talks and many, of course, chats and informal, formal credential between this Mr. Trump's and Mr. Zelensky's delegates. But still, we can see that Mr. Trump's understanding did not change. And European actors, especially the United Kingdom, if we think the relation, especially in this time with Mr. Trump, it can also have not so positive track, Ms. Lavrina. And because of this, I said in my last response that this diplomacy track, at least we need somehow give some credit to push maybe Mr. Putin, to push even the Mr. Lavrov to talk more, because they don't talk. We know that even Mr. Erdogan, even the Turkish counterparts, several times we call Mr. Putin for a meeting, I mean, in Istanbul, in some other parts of the world, I mean, in Eurasia, first of all, but we cannot maybe have a positive result. But we must continue. Because of this, maybe with the leadership summit and with the new diplomacy talking, after such a level of maybe positive talk, Mr. Trump can give a signal to more maybe military equipment, to more maybe military talking, and the sense of course, Ukrainian defense sector, not maybe directly giving, but maybe supporting it in this defense sector. But to this level, I mean, to this level of diplomacy, I think Mr. Trump will keep its position as a neutral actor, also to push these European actors and allies to be much more independent, as he said also in this famous NATO summit in Ankara just months ago.
Mr. Kovalyk, one last question. At the UN Security Council, Washington called on both Russia and Ukraine to return to negotiations and said the United States was prepared to facilitate that process. At the same time, the US didn't join more than 50 countries in a statement calling for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. What does that tell us about the Trump administration strategy? Is Washington deliberately trying to preserve greater distance from the European position in order to maintain leverage with both Moscow and Kyiv?
That is the Trump position. The Trump administration believes itself more of a mediator. The Ukraine wants the U.S. to be on its side. NATO wants the U.S. to be on its side. The EU wants the U.S. to be on its side. But President Trump perceives himself as best positioned to not be on anyone's side, which is, of course, incredibly frustrating to every country that's involved in the Russia-Ukraine war. And I don't see that changing. We saw at the NATO summit in Ankara where President Trump said, would you like to make patriots in Ukraine? Yeah, we'll let you do that. And then President Trump gets back to Washington and his team starts explaining to him, look, there are issues with technology transfer. There are issues that technology can be stolen. There are issues of so many issues that start coming out. President Trump said, okay, then we can't do that. And so everyone's going to have to continue to deal with the wildly changing perspectives. And in the end, the way the war ends is President Putin needs to feel that he won. Optically, he needs to be able to believe that he won. And President Trump's theme has generally been, okay, Vladimir, you started this in 2014. You were fighting Ukraine. You then expanded in 2022. You were fighting Ukraine. 5 years later, you're fighting NATO. You're fighting the European Union. You're fighting other countries. And you've held your own. You've held on to about 20% of Ukraine. You protected Russians. You have shown that you have an incredibly powerful military, that the spirit of your people are power. Now's the time to call it a day. And you can walk away saying that you defeated the EU, you defeated NATO, you defeated the US, if that'll make you feel better. That's what everyone is trying to convince President Putin to do. And it's challenging, primarily because every time there is a discussion about the issues, the goal in negotiations is if you have 10 issues or 20 issues, the goal is to narrow them down to maybe the 2 or 3 or 4 core issues, and then you try to reach a deal. But what's happened during the last year is the Trump administration has been trying to narrow the number of issues. The European Union keeps adding more to them. Ukraine adds more. And if you're Russia, the result is easy. You say, one, well, now you're adding all these conditions. We need time to evaluate them. And while we were evaluating them, we're going to keep killing Ukrainians. And that's pretty much where we are today.
Well, John Kovalyk, senior editor at Issue Insight, and Melik Demirtas, political analyst, former diplomat from Ankara, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. The latest diplomatic activity around Ukraine once again highlights how complex the search for a way forward remains. While international discussions continue, fundamental differences over security, political arrangements, and the conditions for any future settlement remain unresolved. The key question now is whether the current diplomatic efforts can create space for meaningful dialogue and ultimately contribute to a sustainable resolution of the conflict. That's all for this edition of Inside Politics. I'm Anastasia Lavrina. Thank you for watching A News, and I see you next time.